All right, hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I just want to quickly hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb, our moderator for the day.
Thanks, Mike. Good afternoon. I'm Melanie Gottlieb. I'm Deputy Director of ACRO, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar presentation on the Groningen Declaration Network. Before we get started, I'd like to add a few quick notes on logistics. There will be time for Q&A at the end of this session. I ask that you please type your questions in the Questions tab on the right of the webinar dashboard. You can type your questions at any time during the presentation, and I'll hold them until the end and read them aloud for the presenters to address. If you have a technical issue, we'll deal with that right away. So I'd like to start by introducing today's presenters, who are dedicated professionals with a keen interest in the digital data mobility ecosystem, and I've had the pleasure of working with them both over the past several years. First, we have Shelby Stanfeld, who's the Director of the Service Innovation Network at the National Student Clearinghouse and former Registrar at the University of Texas, Austin, and Romesh Vadivel, Assistant Registrar and Director at McGill University, and also President of ARUC, which is the Association of Registrars of the Universities and Colleges of Canada. So we're going to talk today about the Groningen Declaration Network and the Groningen Declaration, or we call it the GDN in the alphabet soup of higher education organizations that we tend to have here. But the goal for the GDN is to create a global, equitable, and accessible student data portability environment. I'd like to share a few important facts that give you a little bit of background on the GDN and how it was created. It was founded in 2012 in the Netherlands with a foundation status of 2016. And what that means is that in 2016, it was incorporated as a foundation in the Netherlands. It is a little similar to a membership organization or a nonprofit that we might have here in the US, but there are a few key differences that actually mainly highlight the way we talk about who our engaged members are. Foundations don't technically have members, and so we often call them participants in the GDN. There are 27 signatory countries and 1,200 participants or members, as we would call them here in the US. And ACRO's been a founding charter member and also has been engaged just from the very beginning. The executive director is Herman de Leeuw, and he is based in the Netherlands. Every year we have an annual convening and we rotate continents. As a global organization, the GDN aims to bring together all of the interested parties in the digital data ecosystem and make the meeting accessible by hosting it in different continents. In 2020, this spring, the meeting will be in India, in Delhi, India. So the GDN, in the way that it operates, supports a global mobility initiatives all around the world. I always think of the meetings as a sandbox where all of the parties in multiple countries get together and talk about and brainstorm about and share best practices and ideas and thoughts and build upon the work of each other. So we have groups from Europe, such as Erasmus Without Paper, MREX. In Africa, we have the African Qualifications Verification Network, which is consists of 14 countries in Africa, and SAQA, which is the Qualifications Authority in South Africa. In North America, we'll talk more about the members there, but ACRO is one of the main members, as well as IMS Global, PASC, and the National Student Clearinghouse. In Australia, the MyEquals Network. We also have groups in Asia. We have the Chinese Ministry of Education Agencies, which is the CSCSE, CHESIC, the CDGDC, And in India, we have national data depositories as well, the CDSL and the NSDL. GDN also works very closely with UNESCO, the World Bank, and the ENIC-NARICS. We support initiatives related to access and the availability of services to lesser developed nations. The goal is to make all countries and all learners a part of the digital data ecosystem. So there is a concept for GDN at its founding called signatories. And signatories, to become a signatory, you basically would pledge that you wanted to be a part of this network and that you are giving a commitment to some of the basic tenets, which are student privacy and data protection, transparent and responsible practices in that area, and the recognition of digital student data and qualifications globally. GDN participants and signatories believe that all citizen learners should have access to secure digital records of their own educational achievements to be shared with whomever they choose, whenever they choose. That idea is evolving very rapidly here in the US around conversations of student self-sovereignty. The GDN supports initiatives that deal with any kind of learner data mobility, also with resettlement and refugee access to services that may otherwise be denied. In general, our goal is to bring resources to address fundamental lack of imbalance for global data and digital capacity. We see that play out in the US. If you think about the fact that in the US we've had the capability and the standards to do digital data transfer between institutions for more than 30 years. ACRA has been involved in the SPEEDY server, and the SPEEDY committee has done a great deal of work, but yet we still have not fully penetrated the US market. And it's a pretty small fraction of US institutions that can both share data digitally and also receive that same data digitally. Can you go forward, Michael? So the goal is to be learner-centric. So at the center of all of the activities of GDN is the global learner. We define a learner not just as a current student, but also as anyone who's participated in any educational activity, embracing the entire life cycle of learning. We have a couple of key functions. One is to convene all of the global depositories, standards bodies, and any authorized representatives that enable digital verification ecosystems. And so that means outside of the US, verification bodies, ministries of education, national data repository bodies. Within the US, that's a much larger group of US parties. It might be service vendors, it's institutions, it's associations like ACRO. We also convene global credential evaluators. This is an area where credential evaluators are quite interested in the ability to transfer data digitally. Credential evaluators do sort of a functional operational piece of the mobility ecosystem, and they're interested in engaging in this digital ecosystem. Also convening global qualification verification networks who do quality assurance. And so we've had the involvement from the US with groups like CHIMA. Outside of the US, that tends to be a ministry. We aim to be inclusive of both traditional and non-traditional providers. And so you might think of a traditional provider as an institution. Non-traditional providers might be vocational providers, might be eventually corporate providers. And we're also attempting to keep in step of how awards are being provided. And so it doesn't really matter how these awards are moving, whether that's paper, whether that's digital, whether that's blockchain. We are looking at the entire infrastructure. We are, of course, moving into the digital and away from the paper, but the principles should be the same. And I am going to hand the mic over to Shelby, who's going to talk a little bit more about the operationalizing.
Right. Thank you, Melanie. Again, this is Shelby Stanfield. I'm with the National Student Clearinghouse and formerly at the University of Texas at Austin. And I've been very fortunate to be involved with the Groningen Declaration Network since 2013 when we were in Beijing, China, which was the second meeting. And there are two facets of this organization that has impressed me the most. The first is the opportunity to convene interested participants that are recognizing some of the same trends that we're recognizing here in the US, and that is with increased student mobility as learners are achieving their educational aspirations through multiple relationships with institutions of education. And with that mobility is the need for sharing information in a secured and efficient manner. So to bring these parties together to think about what are the trends that we're facing, not only locally and regionally, but globally, as we recognize the fact that students are attending education across country boundaries, and what are some of the challenges, but also opportunities that wherewithal and technology will bring to bear as we can set up some automation around the exchange of these education records. So bringing individuals together, let's think about and understand what's the current state with respect to credential digitization within our respective countries and education ecosystems. Do we have educational depositories already established? If not, what would it take to create educational depositories? What would it take to integrate and interoperate these educational depositories? What academic records are recorded in the depositories, and to what extent does that inventory of education records support the students' transition from one educational institution to the next, and what do we need to scale and grow that? So bringing the individuals together that are first and foremost involved in these initiatives to help share ideas and share experiences to identify the current state of digitization of these education records within our respective countries, and then what would it take to expand or integrate. So that's one aspect of it. It's just talk about some of the philosophical principles that are underlining these interests. We can go on to the next slide. But then also to bring individuals together that says, okay, now that we've identified our current environment, as Melanie mentioned, such as India with the National Academic Depository, we get to interact with the agencies that administer these academic repositories to think about how do we set up points of integration and data exchange or document exchange operations with these digital depositories and set up some pilots. And with these pilots, we can do quick, simple, rapid prototypes and proof of concepts to demonstrate the technical viability, the technical feasibility, but then also learn from those prototypes and pilots and use cases that we'd want to support and scale, and then identify what does it take to sustain that. And what's been real interesting is being involved with these conversations coming back year after year. You can see how in one meeting, these relationships get established and some use cases start to be discussed, in the next year actually demonstrate some prototypes and early developments in that space. And then share experiences from that and say, okay, where can we now take these pilots and grow them for use cases? So it's both to understand the principles as well as understand the capabilities of the underlying technologies that we have available, or to share technologies and share approaches to this integration and data exchange opportunities. This next slide will show you just a logo collage of the entities that are now signatories from the US with the Groningen Declaration Network. And I'm quite honored to have been able to sign as a signatory when I was at the University of Texas, picking up on some of the same principles that had us involved in speedy and electronic data exchange while we were there in Texas because of the mobility and the efficiencies that we gained. But we have a number of institutions, a number of service providers. We have participants from the not-for-profit sector as well as the for-profit sector, all coming together to think about how can we contribute the capabilities and the services to meet the needs of the organizations and then to the learners that we're supporting as they go from institution to institution, country to country as part of their educational journey. The next slide lists some of the reasons why this is important. And we see as much as an increase in mobility across the U.S., there's an increase of our students that are taking advantage of learning opportunities in countries outside the U.S. And we also see a growing number of programs in which students from countries outside the U.S. are being invited into our U.S. institutions as part of their educational pursuits. And there's a lot of value that we get from these automations and the integration of these digital repositories, everything from the efficiencies and the scalability that we get through digitization and automation. Of course, with applying best information security practices that we can ensure the accuracy, the authenticity of these documents. They go a long way to fraud prevention, but also to secure these data assets, which are critically important. The accuracy that we gain through computer processes, the reliability. So whether or not we're supporting the mobility of a single learner or 1,000 learners at one time, these same processes can support these operations at scale. And as the number of units within our institutions that are participating in providing these services, whether or not you're in admissions, the registrar's office, and a records management, dealing with curriculum administration, working with each of the schools and colleges in the administration, the value runs deeply across all the units within the organization. So the challenges that we faced here in the U.S. that caused rise to having the speedy standards in multiple formats are exact same issues that we're facing globally. So the same value proposition exists within the Groningen Declaration that we've found here in the U.S.
Hey, Shelby.
Yes.
I would love to, one of the value propositions that's really simple that I love to share, that I thought I would jump in and share, is that when I was institution based, from a very simple, when I explain the power of the GDN to my colleagues who do international admissions, for example, I might tell them that imagine that you were recruiting a student from India, and that student was able to apply and immediately send you or give you access to their records in a digital, instantaneous, and verifiable and secure way, and not have to go through all of the iterations of attempting to get their records. Imagine how much faster and how much time that would save, both on your end as the institution and also from the learner's end. And I have seen in my involvement in the GDN over the past 3 years, I have seen that reality get closer and closer. I mean, I really believe that with every convening and every conference, the power of the GDN is growing and growing exponentially. And I really firmly believe that in my career, we're going to see that be realized.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a great point too. When we look at IIE's publications with respect to the countries of origin in which students from outside the U.S. are coming to the U.S. to study, we see 51% of the students come from 2 countries, India and China. So it doesn't take a lot of different relationships and infrastructure to be established to have a significant beneficial impact to both the learners and the U.S. institutions. So for example, we've worked with the organizations that manage the digital repositories within China. You mentioned CHESIC and CDGDC, as well as the organizations that manage the National Academic Depository in India. Both of them are quite comprehensive, they're robust, they're secured, and they have APIs in which we can set up points of integration between their platforms and the delivery platforms that we have available to US institutions. So with just hookups between those relationships with those partners that we've established through GDN, we can support roughly 51% of the international students studying the US. And similarly, with the platforms that we have here in the US, with the increase of students studying abroad as part of their educational journey, we can set up the automation and facilitate the exchange of records for our US students that are studying abroad. So it doesn't take a lot of different relationships to be established to have a significant beneficial impact to our US institutions and learners. So great point, Melanie. So this next meeting, as Melanie mentioned, is in April in Delhi, India. I would love for everyone to come join us at that meeting and continue. This will be the 9th meeting, and the attendance and the participation has continued to grow every year. And as mentioned, you start to see more and more demonstratable prototypes and systems that are being rolled out and discussing across all different types of technology infrastructures. So it's just a great opportunity. Understanding if you can't make it to India, we want you to be involved and engaged in and aware as to what's going on across the Groningen Declaration Network. Stay apprised of the events and activities that are underway, and possibly set your sights for joining us in Canada in 2021. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ramesh.
Terrific. Well, thanks very much, everyone, and hope you're having a great afternoon. I'm joining you from snowy Montreal, Canada, and specifically from McGill University. As Melanie mentioned, I'm the president of ARUC. It's the Association of Registrars at Universities and Colleges of Canada. And so for the next couple of slides, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey to explore and expand upon a project that's very near and dear to my heart that we've been working on here in Canada for the last couple of years. Stemming from 2015, when Canada and ARUC specifically became a signatory to the Groningen Declaration. So the organization itself was only 3 years old at that time. ARUC saw the need and the pressing urgency to sign on behalf of our members, and we're essentially a members-driven organization like yourselves. We saw the need to put action or take action essentially on behalf of those members, because what we saw in the Groningen Declaration itself really resonated quite deeply for all the things that we do in higher education. If you consider, the value chain from the movement of students from one institution to another, from one level to another, whether it's for exchanges or admissions or transfer, you start piling in other elements of the movement of human capital, which could include moving documents or data through to regulatory bodies, immigration authorities, levels of government, qualification assessors, and so on. We're really talking about the movement of not only human capital, but really the creation to a much deeper extent of pathways for our learners. And so in 2015, ARUC saw the need to not only sign, but really commence what turned into a national project in order to create the capacity essentially for domestic and international mobility and transfer for learners in the Canadian higher education context. We're really talking about creating a pan-Canadian data exchange network for student and document data sharing. And this really was also supported, no coincidence, by the fact that Canada only about 2 years ago, finally after 20 years time, signed the Lisbon Recognition Convention, which really at its foundation supports the recognition of qualifications of learners, and the fact that those qualifications should be recognized wherever that learner happens to travel anywhere in the world. So I invite you at a later stage on your own to visit our project website. We're well underway. We kicked off the project about 3 years ago. We'll be reporting on the progress to date at our June 2020 conference in Niagara Falls, Ontario. But the project itself not only is well underway, but has been and will continue to be quite heavily resourced as we move through to an actual selection of a solution and ultimately a phased deployment. Next slide, please. So what is it we're really trying to create? Well, I can't really talk about what we're trying to create without explaining very quickly who is involved in this. And it's more than just a Rook. We have 3 other organizations that we have partnered with in order to move this thing forward. The Canadian user group of PESC, which is, of course, the organization that hopefully you may be familiar with in the United States, the Post-Secondary Education Standards Council. We also have in Canada the PCCAT, which is the Pan-Canadian Consortium on Admissions and Transfer. So essentially the partnership between a Rook and PCCAT covers both student records and registration through to admissions and transfer and so forth. PESC obviously covers the data standards segment and I guess the plug-in ability of systems, the interoperability of systems. But last but not least, we have CUCIO, which is really the Canadian Universities Council of CIOs. And so we have IT at the table as an active partner in pushing this project forward. Next slide, please. So the project itself, we like to think of it as learner-focused by design, where we're talking about integrating into transfer of data the idea of trust, not only trust with regard to the parties who are engaged in the exchange of data, but equally in the data itself as it is moving seamlessly from node to node. Connectivity, of course, is paramount, not only just across Canada, but equally to other institutions and organizations abroad. And really that provide as a foundation access to those artifacts of learning for our learners and support their mobility. And really at the core, it's about the learners. Next slide, please. So the outcomes that we're seeking, and this is a busy slide, I can appreciate, but on the right of the slide, you'll notice the core outcomes, quality assurance. Regardless of stakeholder, regardless of whom is interacting with that digital artifact of learning, there has to be embedded in that not only trust, but notions with regard to quality assurance and how that plays out within the systems that interact with these learner artifacts. Learner mobility I've discussed already. Labor mobility I've mentioned as well. Data privacy and sovereignty is paramount. In Canada, you may or may not know, but we don't have a federally mandated Department of Education. Each province actually has its own Ministry of Education. They do talk to one another, which is sort of the happy fact. But the reality is that each province is sovereign essentially unto itself with regard to higher education, and data privacy standards actually, or at least legislation, varies slightly from province to province. And so to that end, we, as a core outcome for the project, we're seeking to maintain flexibility and autonomy while increasing efficiency. We don't have as many higher institutes of higher education in Canada. Clearly, our population is smaller than the US. But we are a federation, and as such, you know, the notions of flexibility, autonomy are not only important, but absolutely core values to the overall project. Next slide, please. In moving things forward over the last 3 years, we've done quite a bit of consultation with organizations and institutions across the country. And we've actually solicited a number of written endorsements for the project from, actually it's closing in on 100 or so institutions thus far. These would be universities and colleges, and in Canada, the idea of a college would be a little bit different than in the States. Universities tend to be synonymous with what you would term to be colleges. In Canada, colleges would take on other elements of vocational programming, but not exclusively. Organizations, national associations or organizations that have endorsed the project include, at the highest level, Universities Canada, which is comprised of university presidents or provosts. We have Colleges and Institutes Canada, similar stature. We have support from the Canadian Federation of Students, which I deem to be arguably one of the most important endorsees for the project itself, because if what we're seeking to put in place doesn't resonate with the intended beneficiaries, the students, then clearly we're not on the right path. So to have their support is fundamental. ACRO, you'll see listed on the slide as well. Very happy to have ACRO's support in this regard. Every year, or actually every other year at our biennial conference, we seek once again for our members to weigh in and hopefully to approve the continuation of the mandate. So the fact that we signed on their behalf the Groningen Declaration in 2015, and then we commenced the project about a year or so later, we're constantly consulting and seeking continued support and approval from our members to move things along. And to date, we've been very successful in that regard. Next slide, please. One of the key takeaways from the extensive consultation that I mentioned was the fact that we, by way of an environmental scan, we wanted to ensure that we were floating all of the boats across the country. So we recognized, because we're a federation of roughly independent provinces, with each province having its own mandate and each province also having its own capacity, existing capacity, we needed to take into account whom were the leaders in data exchange and portability, and whom had yet to build out that infrastructure. And obviously at a national level, for this national project to truly be successful, we would be seeking in large part to close as many gaps as possible. So this slide really depicts to some extent where that capacity lies, whom those leaders are, and what types of data it is that they're exchanging and with whom. And so this gave us a new lens through which to look at the project. It also gave us a number of business cases that we could pose essentially as key components to a national solution once that's fully implemented. We could see not only where capacity lies, but equally where the planning stages are from province to province right across the country. Next slide, please. We also wanted to recognize to some extent where the challenges would be, and potentially service failures as well. By way of an environmental scan, and in order to build consensus, we needed to really identify at a fairly high level what the biggest challenges might be, both for inbound data or educational artifacts to post-secondary institutions, as well as outbound to external third parties. So I mentioned, for instance, inbound to post-secondary could be, for instance, high school data. If we're talking about that type of high school data, where is it coming from? Is it within Canada? Is it coming from certain provinces? Is it coming from outside the country itself? And how does that tie into, for instance, student recruitment strategy that may be driving that? But outbound to external third parties, this could be, again, notionally to regulatory bodies or immigration authorities whom might require confirmations of enrollment or graduation, both of which have grown in popularity and demand over the last few years, arguably as a result of identity fraud, which is also on the rise. So by identifying these challenges and also recognizing the larger international trends as they pertain to fraud and due diligence, overlaying individual capacity from province to province, what we saw was essentially a bit of a recipe for the path forward. Next slide, please. So two core functionalities really were distilled from this research, and again, completely underpinned by all the work that the Groningen Declaration has done to date and continues to do. For us in Canada, in the Canadian context, we're seeking for a way for learners to view, curate, and share their credentials and documents whenever they wish, with whomever they want. And then secondly, to create a national level for official document and data exchange capacity for essentially the higher ed sector in Canada to enhance those services that are provided to students, which could involve establishing direct connections with trusted institutions and organizations, not just within Canada, but also around the world. Melanie had discussed, I guess, or made mention of credential evaluation services, and some other organizations were mentioned when Shelby was talking about document transfer and exchange with China, so CHESIC and CDGCB. I never get the acronym right, but anyway, we're talking about trusted entities in foreign countries that are tasked with transferring student data to essentially third parties or different jurisdictions. We know that the Australia New Zealand network came on board in 2017 with their MyEquals network, and that served as a bit of the impetus for Canada to get moving on creating our own data exchange infrastructure, but with these two core functionalities in mind. Next slide, please. The business cases followed from that research and from that scan, both for document as well as for data flows. We know that not all institutions or even jurisdictions will have the capacity for true data flow, but it's not to say that the documents don't already move across borders, both inbound and outbound. We know that things like transcripts exist in a variety of different flavors, but typically either is electronic, albeit may not necessarily machine readable, so PDF, for instance, or the more traditional paper transcripts. And this could also extend to credentials, status documents, and so forth. So for what we're seeking to implement by way of a national solution, the how and the what we know will vary. It already varies now. We know where the points of capacity are by province, and there are variations with regard to what types of data or what types of artifacts are being exchanged. But the national solution, once implemented, should be, for the most part, and to the extent possible, payload agnostic, where the document or data can exchange mostly freely across borders, and ideally not dependent on a specific technology. Next slide, please. So what we're again seeking is something which is learner-centered, which is flexible and obviously can grow and build, can be built upon basically for years to come. That will be interoperable, again, standards agnostic, permission-based, accessible to learners, and to the extent possible, clearly from an institutional perspective, as efficient as we can make it. Next slide, please. So I'll pause here really just to state that Canada has been involved in the Groningen Declaration via a ROOC since 2015. And we're very fortunate as a consortium of 4 organizations depicted here. We're very fortunate to be successful in our bid to host the Groningen Declaration on Canadian soil in 2021. And so consider this to be a formal invitation, as it were, to come to Ottawa, Canada for the 10th Groningen Declaration Network annual meeting. Next slide, please. Ottawa is a wonderful city. It's our national capital. Student mobility, I think, is foundational to Canada in many ways. And this statement really tends to sum it up. This is from Universities Canada from about 4 years ago, where young people, the idea basically is giving young people the opportunities to learn and build relationships abroad, and how that is essential to a global future. Student mobility, of course, is essential not just to Canada's global future, but to global future writ large. And I think that's a nice way to tie things up and throw it back to the Groningen Declaration as as a call to action, as it were, not only for institutions and individuals at organizations around the world, but for governments as well. Our conference theme is mobility, digital citizenship, and student experience. Some people conflate the word student with learner because the idea of a learner transcends just the period of time when you were in fact a student. But regardless of how you self-identify, again, the invitation is to join us in Ottawa in May of 2021 for what will be an outstanding conference. These 4 organizations, the links will be provided to you, I believe, afterwards. But again, these are all linked from our project page. You can delve into this at your discretion. And if you have questions now or later on, I'm certainly happy to make my contact information available to you as well.
Thank you so much, Ramesh.
Thank you.
I wanted to note before we move on to questions that I'm always genuinely impressed with the approach and the success so far of the Canadian pilot to build this digital infrastructure. Canada is a country that's most like the highly decentralized US education system. And so your ability to gain consensus and buy-in across the provinces always gives me hope that we can grow our infrastructure and float all of our boats in the US as well. So I'm always cheered by your progress.
Well, thank you again for your support. It's been invaluable.
I will pause here to see if there are any questions from our participants. I will remind you that questions should be typed into the question box to the right of your screen. And I haven't seen any yet. And if there are no questions, then I will say thank you again to both of our presenters, Shelby and Ramesh. Like all of our webinars, this presentation will be archived and will be found on our site, acro.org. I want to tell you about a couple of things that are coming up in the very near future. On February 18th, we have a quick take, which is a conference call style format on a hot topic issue that we are offering at ACRO. This month's quick take will be institutional roles and responsibilities for the US Census, and we will have guests from both the Department of Education and also from the US Census Bureau, so it promises to be very informative. Our next webinar is on March 4th, and that will be 2 p.m. Eastern, and that is on Pearson Qualifications 101, a practical guide to Edexcel and BTEC credentials. And our next 3 conferences upcoming are the ACRO annual meeting from April 5th to 8th in New Orleans, Louisiana. The Summer Institute for International Admissions is July 20th to 24th in Arlington, Virginia. And our Technology and Transfer Conference will be July 12th to 14th, and that is in Boston, Massachusetts. I thank you all very much for your attention today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next ACRO webinar or at another event. Thanks so much and have a wonderful afternoon.
Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.